Now the United States had been involved in the Second World War. The people at home now begin to engage once again in total war. And so we'll see the actions at home, the home front, the government in the war, women in the war, minorities and the war. The picture you see there is of an actress named Betty Grable. She is known as the pinup girl who won the war. This photograph was labeled by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential photographs of all time. And while it may seem somewhat sexual and exploitative by today's terms, it was a reminder to the men abroad what they were fighting for back home. At first, the Army thought that this picture was too lewd and they didn't like it that much and they tried to discourage it, but that was like trying to tell kids not to look at certain magazines, shall we say. So what they did is, if you can't beat them, join them. And they started using Betty Grable pictures as a means by which they could teach soldiers how to read a map by putting graphing coordinates on the pictures of Betty Grable. She was considered to be one of the hardest working women in show business. She made movies right and left. They were never high quality movies, but they didn't need to be because they were always designed to let the boys abroad know that she was waiting for them when they came home. More than 16 million men and almost 2 million women enlisted in all the services. The Navy was the most sought after one. Navy, where you could fly and be on ships and so forth, but plenty of people enlisted in the Army and in the Marines as well. The country also now looked at its most recent immigrants, especially the Japanese, and said that these people were a security threat to the United States. They were also under threat themselves because many Americans, being what they were, called them un-American and unpatriotic, and that they would serve as a fifth column for the Japanese. And so we begin to intern these individuals into internment camps. Now, they are concentration camps, but they are not to be compared with the concentration camps of Europe, which were work camps and extermination camps. These were living camps. They weren't in the best of places and under the best conditions, but they were hardly brutal. Okay, that needs to be said. Essentially, what you had were two groups of Japanese Americans. You had Nisei. Nisei are Japanese Americans born in America. That means they are American citizens by birth. Then you also had Issei. These are Japanese immigrants who became naturalized U.S. citizens. We made no distinction between them. Executive Order 9066 then put these individuals into the camps in many ways to keep them from being the targets of mobs and riots that could have broken out in California and on the West Coast. Later on, several years after the war, a man by the name of Isako Korematsu sued the United States for deprivation of his civil rights. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of the U.S. government and said that in the time of war, this was necessary. However, everybody knew that the Constitution was being suspended for the war, which it was not supposed to be. And so they applied the rule of strict scrutiny, which means that in this case and in this case only can this action be justified. In other words, it doesn't carry any precedent for future actions of the U.S. government. In other words, they said, you did it once and you probably thought you were doing the right thing, but you're not going to do it anymore. Many Japanese Americans wanted to show their patriotism, and they joined the military as a result. The most famous Japanese regiment was the 442nd Infantry Regiment, whose shield and motto was "Gold for Broke." And they would have the most medals of honor awarded to them of any other regiment because the Japanese wanted to prove their patriotism. Now, the 442nd fought in Europe. They did not fight in the Pacific because, well, when your enemy looks like you want to make sure that there's no confusion. This young Japanese American who was born in San Francisco, California, his name is Hosato Takei. Well, he overcame his internment in a Japanese American camp, and he actually changed his name to George Takei. He then went into acting, and he became Mr. Sulu of Star Trek and starred in a number of movies and TV shows, including Hawaii Five-0, The Green Berets, and he's now a leading spokesperson of the LGBTQ movement. In the upper left is 442nd Regiment Squad Leader Sergeant Daniel Inouye, as he checks for German units in France in November of 1944. He would lose part of his left arm and then later become United States Senator from Hawaii. He only died a few years ago. The bottom right is Sadao Munamori, who was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor after he sacrificed his life near Saravezza, Italy, to save those of his fellow officers. He was the only Japanese American to be awarded the Medal of Honor during or immediately after World War II. The Medals of Honor that the 442nd got were almost a decade after the war. The entire nation now got behind the president to win this war. On December the 7th, 1941, the Great Depression officially came to an end, and the United States achieved full employment. Roosevelt now went from Dr. New Deal to Dr. Win the War, and the fireside chats would continue. But it shifted from the New Deal to the war. Industry had factories running 24/7. There was an industrial boom in the South. Cities like Mobile, Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, New Orleans, Louisiana, now begin to have growing industries in the war. And the people at home did their part. They invested themselves completely in this war. They planted victory gardens so as not to go to the grocery store to buy vegetables. That way those vegetables could be shipped overseas to the boys. They rationed. Everybody had what was known as an ABC card. The A was for food, the B was for the sundries, and the C was for gasoline. They rationed gas at this time, which we're thinking about these days, aren't we? There were drives for rubber, scrap metal, etc. Newspaper, nylon stockings, which could be used to line weapons, and the polyester could be put into weapons. Now women went without wearing hosiery and so forth on their legs. This is how a nation got itself behind the war, in very much the same way that you're seeing what's happening in Ukraine these days. Rationing, preserving, recycling were standard practices during the war. It's telling people to can their foods, to find as much scrap metal as they can. You notice that there's even a racial animus aspect to this. Let's help slap the Jap right off the map with our scrap. The role of the federal government, which had been expanding drastically during the New Deal, now expands even further as the president is given dictatorial powers over the government for the prosecution of the war. Roosevelt creates the Office of Economic Stabilization to control inflation during World War II through regulations on price, wage, and salary increases. He creates the Office of War Mobilization and puts in charge of this a man by the name of James F. Burns, nicknamed the Assistant President. Jimmy Burns, who came from South Carolina, was an old unreconstructed Democrat, and he becomes pretty much the war czar. If anything needed to get done or somebody needed access to the president about something with the war, well, then you had to go see Jimmy Burns, who coordinated all the government agencies. Bernard Baruch, the economist who had lent his expertise during World War I, is back on board in World War II. There is a war production board to make sure that war industries are coordinated properly. You need to not have everybody making the same thing. You need to have orders go out for certain things. You have the National War Labor Board, which helps regulate strikes and keep strikes from happening, or the Office of War Information, which gets information out to the people in the proper manners. The Smith-Connolly Act in 1943 helped settle labor disputes. And this way, Roosevelt could come in and actually tell both sides, you need to get everybody back to work. And if one side doesn't want to give in, such as the business owners, then Roosevelt said he would nationalize them. And if labor didn't want to agree and was holding out unreasonably, then he would threaten to draft all of them and put them in the army. Wars cost money, and the government had to pay for this war. People had to be paid so that they could have their jobs and bring money home. Tax hikes were definitely part of this, but you also had, most importantly, war bonds. War bonds are a form of economic nationalism. It gives the people a sense of investment in the country and in the effort, because a war bond means that you are able to lend the government your money, and then after time, when the bond matures, you get it back with interest. There were several types of bonds. There was the individual bonds. Children could buy savings stamps, which after so many stamps were bought, then you could buy a bond. Of course, many big financiers purchased lots and lots of bonds, but when you wanted a bond campaign, then you would get artistic and celebrity campaigns. Plenty of posters, or you see here, actress Dorothy Lamour getting on stage and selling bonds to the people in New York. At the end of Hollywood films, once you went to the theater, you saw the end of the film, and at the end there would be an advertisement to go and buy bonds. This is how the United States fought wars back then. Everybody was doing their part. Here you see the famous comedic duo, Bud Abbott and Lou Costello, who gave us the famous Who's on First, What's on Second, I Don't Know's on Third routine, and had a long-standing comedy show, the Abbott and Costello Show. They're out there selling bonds, doing their shtick, and getting people entertained so that people would buy bonds. Women did their part in the war. From the housewife who stayed at home and kept the house and participated in the scrap drives and the paper drives and the rubber drives and canned foods and so forth, to industry itself and even the military. Women were a part of this war effort. Women worked in factory or office jobs. As men left the factory to go serve in the military, women moved into their places. This is where you get the famous Rosie the Riveter. Many women who wanted to work in the factories needed to have someone to take care of their children. And so the Community Facilities Act of 1942 starts establishing daycares. Women also begin to notice, hey, I'm doing the same job that men do, but I'm not getting paid the same amount. This becomes a big thorn in the side of women for a long time. And minority women suffer a double burden because they're not just women, they're black women. And yet they do exactly the same things that white women do, who do exactly the same things that white men did in the factory. More than 350,000 women joined the military. They served in the Women's Army Corps, the WAVES, which was the Navy Auxiliary, WASP, which was the Air Corps Auxiliary, and SPARS, which was the Coast Guard Auxiliary. They served as clerks and typists for the military. They served as nurses in the Navy. They served as truck drivers. They even served as pilot trainers. Since women were not allowed in combat, they trained combat pilots back in the United States. At the bottom right, you see Eastine Counter, a black woman who works on a Liberty ship, the SS George Washington Carver. A Liberty ship was the great supply ships of World War II. There's a model of it in the World War II Museum there. This picture shows women at work on drill bits in a factory, making the bits that are put into drills. Women's Air Force Service pilots, WASPs, flew planes from factories to military bases. In this picture, Frances Green, Margaret Kirchner, Ann Waldner, and Blanche Osborne leave their plane, named the Pistol Packin' Mama, in Ohio. Minorities also did their part in the war and fought for greater civil rights during the war. Executive Order 8802 banned discrimination in defense industries. Now there you see A. Philip Randolph, who created the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was a largely black union of the men who took care of the luggage and attended to people's needs on the trains. Later on, A. Philip Randolph will organize a march on Washington for jobs and freedom in 1963, in which Dr. Martin Luther King would be one of the featured speakers, and he would give a, shall we say, significant speech then. In 1941, the Fair Employment Practices Commission banned discriminatory employment by federal agencies and all unions and companies engaged in war-related work. The Congress of Racial Equality adopted Gandhi's tactics of nonviolent resistance wherever there was discrimination. There were plenty of black-white tensions in the factories in northern cities. For instance, in June of 1943, there was a race riot in Detroit, as African Americans who had moved into Detroit during World War I and then continued to move in as part of the Great Migration now begin to run up against whites, begin to compete for jobs against whites in the factories of Detroit, and this leads to a racial riot. In the military, Benjamin O. Davis is the first black man to serve as a general officer in the U.S. Army, that is, a general in the Army. Detroit became a hotbed of racial violence from the Great Migration onward, and white Detroiters often resorted to violence to maintain white privilege and, most importantly, keep their communities as white as possible. African Americans served in the military, but it was a segregated military, and most African Americans were relegated to support services, cooks, stewards in the Navy, longshoremen, cargo workers, behind the scenes, very menial work at times. But some African Americans did see combat. For instance, the famous Tuskegee Airmen. Latinos did their part in the war. They were agricultural workers who had very poor wages because of their ethnic status. In Los Angeles, a thing called the zoot suits now broke out. Zoot suits were very baggy. They used a lot of cloth. This is sort of a defiance of the rationing by Latin Americans who felt that they were being disrespected, and so they began wearing these baggy zoot suits, and this created a riot in Los Angeles in the 1940s. This riot is documented actually in a Netflix documentary. Of course, there were Native Americans, Indians, the Navajo code talkers. Because the Japanese and the Germans didn't understand their language, they could talk over open radios and not be understood. The most famous of all the Indians that fought in World War II is perhaps Ira Hayes. He's one of the 6 men who helped raise the flag on Iwo Jima. The war also had participation by homosexuals. The Army and the military gave tests to many people to try and weed out what they called queers. And oftentimes those who enlisted who did not disclose their sexual identity when found out were put into queer stockades. What they found out in these queer stockades is that they were not alone. There were other men in there with them. And they begin to talk and they begin to form friendships and networks. The gay pride movement begins in the queer stockades of World War II. And these are the people that are going to be protesting in the 60s for recognition of LGBTQ rights. This photograph shows an auto factory in Detroit that has been retooled in order to make planes. Here are African American Rosie the Riveters working in a wartime factory in a machine shop, doing the work that men did and other white women did. On the left is General Benjamin O. Davis, the first African American general in the United States Army. On the right, you see the Tuskegee Airmen, who were noted for the red tails on their planes. They never lost a single bomber that was under their protection. They themselves lost several pilots, one of whom, his remains are now being dug up in the Austrian Alps after a bombing run over Europe. But they never lost a single bomber. At first, they were heavily discriminated against, but by the end of the war, every bomber crew was fighting over getting the Tuskegee Airmen to take care of them.